Hi everyone, hear me okay at the back? Yeah, good. So I'm Ben. I've been told I look like a tech bro, but I'm actually a regulation guy having a midlife crisis. So I know, we're all here, everyone's very excited about AI. I don't think anyone's very excited about regulation, but it's here, it's coming. So, I'm going to try to help you understand the basics. Slides are working. So Stuart earlier and Sabio are talking about AI as the art of the possible, and I think this phrase was actually coined in respect to politics, right? So it was actually the 19th century German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, I learned from Google this morning. And when people talk about the art of the possible in terms of politics, they're really talking about sort of pragmatism over sweeping reform. But I don't think that's actually the case with AI, because there's so much political capital vested in regulation in this space that we're actually talking about something different. And so the figure on the slide is from the OECD. They're tracking AI policy initiatives across the world, and they've already totted up more than 1,000. So I'm going to focus on three things: why regulate AI, what does the regulation look like, and how will it affect us, and particularly those of you in this room. So factors sort of underpinning this, I think, overwhelming trend towards AI policy regulation. So most obviously, we've got fears about AI futures, some of them sort of very dystopian, think sort of killer robots, killer artificial superintelligence. And I think this has sort of forced the hand of policymakers who now feel compelled to act to protect their electorates, rightly or wrongly. Of course, not everyone is as concerned about AI, of course, and some people believe that sort of Silicon Valley ethics will be enough to deliver AI for good. For me, that's a ship that's probably sailed, thanks to successive antitrust cases, social media, and all of its ills. So we were going to have a little bit of video footage from Elon Musk, but we'll skip that. But it was Elon Musk talking about 2029 being the year that general AI wipes us all out. And I would say that we hope that's as good as his other predictions in this space. But I'm going to give you some quotes from Meta's AI leadership team, and they said, come on, this is preposterously ridiculous. It's unhinged. And, I should say they're not addressing this directly to Elon, but they're talking about fears about artificial general intelligence. Yuval Noah Harari, some of you may know him, he's the author of Sapiens and other great books, got a huge following, usually worth listening to. So he, rightly points out, and this is obvious, this is the first technology in history that can make decisions and create new ideas by itself, right? And this is inseparable from the capacity to make mistakes. And I think, this is really, at the core of what we're talking about here. And Harari himself is firmly on the side of regulation. He suggests we need a global framework for AI regulation and the equivalent of a sort of global World Health Organization for AI. The Financial Times, this is just from an op-ed, is warning about, the risks of runaway bureaucracy. And I think, this is also probably fair comment, though I would add that regulation always needs bureaucracy to explain and enforce it, and the more complex the regulatory area, the further and the faster the bureaucracy has to run. And we may not like it, but I think that's how it is. OpenAI, pity us having to comply with all of this different legislation. This was Sam Altman testifying to the US Congress a couple of weeks ago, and he's referring to state versus federal legislation in the US. And in the US, some states are starting to legislate on AI, partly because of Trump's disdain for all regulation. But I think these words are sort of broadly reflective of big tech's approach to regulation everywhere. Trust us, don't over-regulate us, this is going to deprive you of all of your future toys and tech wins. Here's an article from the academic journal Patterns. So the authors identified 17 what they called resonating principles prevalent in the policies and guidelines of their data set. So 17 common AI principles, and I'll come on to some of these. But it's fair to say the AI ethics field is now fairly saturated. Has this ethics boom peaked? So having promised to introduce AI regulation in its manifesto, the new Labour government, together with the Trump administration, recently refused to sign a declaration on inclusive AI from the recent Paris AI Summit. And there's an underlying suggestion that says the focus on trust and safety may be giving away to cooperation among states to woo investment from AI companies, and that this could create some sort of countervailing race to the bottom. I think this is possibly happening to a limited extent, but I think it's unlikely to stem the overall tide, the overall trend towards regulation, and I'll come back to why I think this is the case. So the UK approach, we've gone for policy rather than regulation, what's called soft law. And it's actually pretty standard in terms of the global consensus on AI ethics. So key principles: safety, security, transparency, explainability, fairness, accountability, redress, and so forth. But of course, all of this is all very well in principle. What does it mean in practice? And we'll come on to this. For what it's worth, I think that questions around fairness and contestability and redress are probably the ones that are going to be most central. I think they'll probably be settled and tested in the courts, and the rest will be left to guidance and regulatory action. So what's going to happen in the UK is that existing domain-specific regulators are effectively tasked with regulating AI in accordance with their existing mandates. So Information Commissioner's Office, Ofcom, Competition and Markets Agency, Financial Conduct Authority, Department of Education, etc. All are going to be tasked with issuing guidance on AI, and some of these bodies have already started to do that. At the same time, the regulatory environment in the UK is changing slightly due to things like the recently adopted UK Online Safety Act, which some of you may have heard of. We've got reform of the UK data protection rules, and it's possible the UK government may also decide to weaken copyright rules precisely to woo AI companies, as I was saying earlier. And all of this is going to have a significant bearing on future AI development and this regulatory space. So moving on to the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act, this was proposed in 2021, adopted 3 years later, and it's actually going to be partly enforced from August this year and fully enforced from August 2026. And I've put a question mark there because there's a little fun fact that China is actually ahead of the EU in some respects, having adopted rules on recommender algorithms, AI-generated content, and generative AI in 2022 and 23. So their legislative process is, of course, much more straightforward. So the EU AI Act follows what's called a risk-based approach. At the top of the pyramid, you have unacceptable risk, prohibited applications, and we might call this the Black Mirror approach. So this is things that you're not going to be allowed to do. So things like a ban on things like facial recognition in public spaces, generalized social scoring systems, and emotion recognition in the workplace. And I know this is relevant to some of you in the room, so we'll come back to that. Moving down the pyramid, you have these high-risk applications. This is where most of the Act is focused. And here we're talking about things like policing and criminal justice, but also employee management and access to essential public and private services. So again, potentially relevant for some of you in this room. The next rung down, we have limited risk. This includes things like chatbots in non-high-risk contexts. And here the obligations are actually pretty minor. You're just going to have to inform people that they're interacting with an AI if this isn't already obvious to them. at the bottom, minimal risk, that's things like spam filters with no corresponding regulatory obligations. So if we look at how the EU AI Act works, it actually contains broadly the same principles as the UK policy, but these are transposed into legal requirements for the various high-risk domains. And they apply separately to providers and deployers. So providers are essentially responsible for making sure their systems comply before they put them on the market. And for this, they have to go through what's called an EC conformity assessment, or they will. And they also have to ensure that the deployers, those using these systems, fully understand how they work. For the deployers of these AI systems, I guess that's you guys in this room, you're responsible for deploying these AI services as intended, for monitoring their function and impact, for providing information to affected persons, and for reporting serious incidents to regulators. And it gets sort of a little complicated because deployers can become providers if they take an AI system like a generative AI, and then they develop a high-risk system off the back of it, or if you make significant amendments to an AI system that's been placed into service. In terms of compliance, the Act is going to work broadly similarly to data protection laws, so the GDPR. So we'll have an EU regulator, national regulators responsible for guidance and enforcement. There are some key exemptions to the high-risk categories that might be relevant to you guys. So this is where AI is only used for narrow procedural or preparatory tasks, where it's used sort of after the fact on previously completed activities, and where it doesn't have a material impact on decision-making. Importantly, these exemptions will not apply when you are using AI for profiling, so at the individualized level for making predictions about behavior or preferences or interests. Moving on to generative AI, this actually wasn't even part of the EU AI Act until sort of year 3 of the negotiations. So the drafters of the 2021 proposal, who were tasked with identifying all the future risks posed by AI, they hadn't even seen ChatGPT coming, and I think that highlights the challenges of regulating in this space and why I think people are rightly concerned with over-regulation. So generative AI may be limited risk or high risk. It depends on the context it's used. And there's associated rules on things like deepfakes and tagging AI-generated content, and you might have already sort of seen platforms starting to implement these safeguards ahead of the Act. For developers of generative AI, so they must provide technical documentation to deployers, robust technical documentation about how it works. They must comply with the copyright directive in terms of training their models, and they must publish a summary of how their models were trained. Now, there's a higher compliance bar for generative AI models that present what's called systemic risk. And this is defined as models trained above the 10 to the power of 25 flops threshold. I'm not even sure what that is, but I believe it's floating point operations. And these are models that the EU said, well, these cost tens of millions to develop. We're only talking about the top tier providers, and this is why they need extra regulation. And they're actually going to be regulated like very large online platforms in what's called the EU Digital Services Act. And what this act does, it's quite interesting from a sort of legal philosophy point of view. For the first time, it says to big tech, you're not just responsible for illegal activities or content that takes place on your platforms, you're also responsible for harmful content, for things, Stuart mentioned them earlier in his talk, but things that may harm society or groups within it, things that may harm democracy. And so, yeah, the big generative AI models are going to be regulated in much the same way. The way it works in the UK is very different. They're going to be regulated by the new Online Safety Act, and that really focuses on sort of search, and on user-to-user services and on sort of group messaging services, so where people can share content with each other effectively, or where search engines are providing information. And this takes broadly the same approach as the Digital Services Act. It says, again, you service providers who are doing this, you have an obligation to prevent the spread of harmful content on your platforms, and the mechanisms by which you must do this are things like age verification, robust content moderation, and associated sort of takedown. So I'm just going to whiz through a few things that may be relevant to those of you in this room. Sentiment and big data analysis, I think I mentioned earlier, there's quite a permissive environment for data that's analysed after the fact. The challenges arise when sentiment and emotions are analysed in real time. I also mentioned earlier that the EU AI Act actually prohibits the inference of emotions in workplaces. And the European Commission has just helpfully published 140 pages of guidance on how to interpret these prohibitions. And basically what it says is, using webcams and voice recognition systems by a call center to track their employees' emotions, such as anger, that's prohibited. There is an exemption for training purposes, but that exemption says it's as long as HR doesn't use the results of those outputs to make decisions about staffing. Using voice recognition systems by a call center to track their customers' emotions, so anger, impatience, the things you're probably already interested in, that is not prohibited. I think there's going to be challenges in sort of ring fencing how some of this technology works in practice, and I think it's probably fun times ahead for your IT, HR, and compliance teams. But again, this is the EU AI Act I'm talking about, and doesn't apply to systems used solely in the UK. Automated decision making, so this gives individuals the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on the automated processing of their data, including profiling. And the threshold is that this is where decision making produces legal or similarly high impact effects concerning them. So it's particularly relevant for things like financial and health decision making, employee management, recruitment, things where individuals should have recourse to a human decision maker, or other safeguards should be implemented. And this is actually part of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. The EU AI Act does not materially change this obligation, but what it does is sort of enhance the obligations to have a human in the loop, where AI is contributing to decision making. And corresponding to that obligation is to ensure that the subsequent decisions are fair to the individuals, irrespective of what the AI comes up with. And I think this is going to get really interesting in terms of what that actually means in practice. So there's this huge debate about is AI going to take all our jobs? I don't think so. What's realistically more likely to happen is that these jobs are going to entail more and more use and management and supervision of AI-driven systems. So this implies there will be a human in the loop. My guess, however, it's going to become sort of much harder to draw a clear line between something being fully automated in practice, so automated decision making, and forms of what we might call automated supervision, which in practice may produce very much the same effects as far as the individual is concerned. I said earlier that the AI ethics field is saturated, it's got nowhere left to go, but I have come up with my own term, agentic accountability. I Googled that as well. I'm the first, so I'm claiming it. But I think this is going to be key to the sort of future world that Stuart was helping us imagine first thing this morning. And so, what might agentic accountability mean? I think, some of it's very obvious. You're going to need to be accountable for the actions and outputs of your chatbots and your agents. That's the relatively simple part. I've lost my slide, doesn't matter. you're accountable for what your agents do. I don't know if anyone saw last week that Grok went a bit rogue, started engaging in Holocaust denial, far-right conspiracy theories. It was described as a human error by a programmer. But so at a grand level, I think this is quite challenging. But I think for the sort of the level we're talking about in this room, probably quite surmountable. I think where it's interesting and where it's gets extremely complicated is where, or still if at this point, your customers are using AI agents as Stuart implied they might be. And they're effectively querying your agents and APIs. So you've got vast amounts of data, going forwards, backwards, sideways. And the human in the loop is essentially sort of decreasing on both sides of this construction. And, I think there are actually precedents for this. It's sort of akin to the challenges posed by the intersection between search engines, between data mining, and the way the online advertising industry currently works. And just last week, the EU Court of Justice ruled actually for the second time that the transparency and consent framework around online advertising is effectively a massive breach of data protection rules. And so, when Stu was talking about this sort of future agentic world, yes, there's definitely some very obvious trust and control issues, but I think, there's also some very practical challenges just about, how do we do data protection? How do we do transparency? How do we do consent in these extremely complex and opaque frameworks? And this is where the online advertising industry has really struggled and, as the court said, effectively failed to comply with data protection law. So just to conclude, where does all of this leave us? I've talked about sort of complex and overlapping regulatory regimes, and they are complex, and there is a lot of regulation that intersects. But I think despite the complexity and the geographic divergence in terms of regulation, I think we are going to see more regulatory convergence internationally over time. I think this will partly be a result of court cases, partly be a result of sort of harmonized guidance as countries take inspiration from one another. And we'll also see ISO standards. There's already an ISO standard on AI management systems. I think, regardless of the direction of travel, you need to understand what laws apply to you, where and why. I haven't mentioned bias and discrimination yet. These are usually sort of front and center about discussions about AI regulation for very good reason. But suffice to say at this point is we have very strong anti-discrimination laws in this country and in Europe. And if your AI discriminates against certain groups in practice, so the elderly, women, minorities, etc., I think you do run a very significant risk of being found out and held to account. We talked about the risk-based approach. I think it's incumbent upon us, to understand what those risks look like, and it's equally incumbent upon them to implement effective risk mitigation. And I think this is going to require, certainly in the bigger organizations, robust AI governance. I love ethics, but it's certainly not going to be enough. I think just last couple of points, document everything you do, from sort of model selection to training data to deployment, but also ask questions of your suppliers. As I mentioned, under the Act, there are very strong obligations on service providers, and you should do your due diligence on how they're complying with the Act, because this is going to help you in your own compliance journey. And I'll just finish by saying, pretty much what I said to every compliance client I ever made a sales pitch to. The golden rule: say what you do what you say. Be prepared to justify it to a regulator. That's it. Thanks. I look forward to chatting more on the panel.